It's now 6 p.m., and I'll call the special meeting of the City Council of the City of Victorville to order. The first item is public comment. Public comment will be limited to 3 minutes, and you must fill out a card located in the foyer and bring it to our city clerk if you wish to speak on this item. Anyone wishing to speak on public comment? There are none. We'll go to item number 2, a request to approve an additional appropriation and authorize payment of fees to Caporese and Larson in connection with 2007 audit.
For approval?
Second.
Chairman Curley. Went away.
Almond? What is,
Not on my screen.
what is your vote? I'll enter it for you.
Pardon me?
What is your vote? I'll enter it.
Thank you.
Next on the agenda is item number 3, is discussion and possible presentation of 2006-2007 audit. Mr. Cox?
Mr. Mayor and Council, we've waited a considerable amount of time to get this audit. As someone indicated, it's 20 months late. I didn't go back and read it that carefully, but I came in very late on this. I have had some discussions with the auditor and the finance director, Mr. John Sullivan. I felt it was in the best interest of everyone, including the city, to get this audit and to get it out. It is unfortunate that the audit is showing what it shows. I took personal issue with the 2 items. Number 1, right down to the hangars. I wasn't able to convince anyone that I was right. I intend to look into that subsequent to this. The second issue is that the auditors have reported tremendous amount of expenditures as a result of having to go back and re-audit the prior year's audit, and I had requested that prior year audit be contacted. I think that they have the right to come in and either defend the figures or make the changes. To date, if they were notified, I have no indication that they were. I intend to do that. I think we have an obligation to notify the past auditors for the input. The audit is before you. It is a public document. It is complete, and I believe that the work is done in regard to this audit. We have another audit. This is the 2006-2007. Next is 2007-2008. Before you, I have distributed the estimated cost as best as I can determine what they were. Somewhere around June 26, 2007, there was a basic fee given to the City Council of $82,875, supplemental for $24,900 for a basic total of $107,000, and then there was some other work that was authorized, apparently requested to the finance director, approved. I could have been approved by the manager, I'm not sure. But the end result was that you have seen at the bottom that the cost is additional $210,000 over the amount of over $154,000 that's been paid. There was a statement made as if there was an automatic assumption that the auditors would continue now with the 2007-2008 audit. I would ask the Council's approval to authorize me to look into that. I can't find a contract that's signed for that work. I don't want to proceed automatically with the assumption that they would do that work. Therefore, I'd like to take a look at just what has been paid for that work. I'm assuming that all of this work wasn't only on the one audit, and I want to make sure that if we've paid for the other audit, I want a timeline, and I want to make sure that that is done with absolute dollars submitted. In reviewing the record as best as I could tell, for the record, I was requested to authorize a check for the council to validate. I'm not authorized to sign these kind of numbers. I don't want this to happen again. And therefore, before we proceed, we will nail down the amount as exact as we can possibly get exacted for the audit, and how much has been paid to date, how much work has been done to date. and that remains to be negotiated. I ask council's authorization for me to be in charge of that.
So moved.
Now, well, discussion before we...
Okay.
Just on his request.
Oh,
Second?
I'd like to
Have
speak to
questions?
that. I think this council needs to make consideration to not continue with this auditors for the next year. There's some very fundamental differences between the philosophy of this auditing team, clearly expressed in this preliminary document, and what, in my opinion, of 20 years on this council, 30 years in public service, doesn't make me an expert in auditing, but it certainly makes me an expert enough as one of the educated laymen trying to read it, communicate with the public, that this is fundamentally flawed. And let me give you a basic idea where I'm coming from. On the page independent auditor's letter, 3-page letter that starts this out, one of their basic premises for the audit is the MDA. For the folks in the audience, that's management, discussion, and analysis. All three of those words imply an extensive amount of opinionated ideas built into the whole philosophy of presenting their audit. Their whole audit is built around the 5 points that they have expressed on that page 1 of their audit there, all of which are MDAs. Part of the discussion in some of these things would have been that you had to have gone to and communicated with some of the department heads, certainly IS being one of them. They did none of that. They expressed their opinions, and those opinions, in my opinion, are not substantiated in this document. And yet, most of the work that they've done, the time that they've consumed, the billings that they've run, have focused in on this development of an MDA as the platform for their whole financial audit. I think that's wrong. I think that does a disservice to this council, and it does a disservice to the community wanting to know the factual numbers. Do we have money in the bank? Can we pay our bills? I don't think you can get that clear message out of an approach like this in this audit. So I find exception to that. I could go through point by point a number of areas here that I've outlined that I find problems with. Their third paragraph down, in my opinion, is factually a flaw. It says the city has not maintained adequate internal controls and accounting records. I believe those internal controls and accounting records, even though they've morphed into various forms, started well back when Jim Cox was our city manager and continued into the area that we're into today, 8 years down the line after Jim left, and is now back on that. But this whole approach to the audit is, to me, fundamentally flawed and is not useful for the city. I don't dispute some of their numerical analysis to the audit. Draw whatever conclusions you might from that. I do dispute their analysis of the way they go about the impairment issue versus a redevelopment agency. The city of Victorville has one of the largest redevelopment agencies in the state of California. The concept of impairment that they're building into our audit is kind of the antithesis of everything that a redevelopment agency stands for. So if you're going to build that kind of a philosophy around the audit, you've got to at least understand how the redevelopment agency works, what the philosophies are behind a redevelopment agency, and how any city that would have the responsibility to deal with that would deal with it on their books and not be calling it an impairment as they've been called here. It makes a blight on what otherwise would be a very solid financial approach we have to most of what we've been doing in here. Everything that we've done has not been a success. Obviously, the national crisis has hit everybody right down to the local level. That aside, this audit here speaks to more of a management style than it does to the numericals. And have we done anything illegal or not? And if we have, certainly point that out to the community. So I cannot support this, for my individual vote, this audit team going on. I do think we need to accept this audit, whatever it is now. The final draft is here. I assume it's pretty much what we've got in front of us. Pay the bill. I voted against that because I felt that they created a billing problem and they're self-inflicted on their own part here. They've taken a long time. They've gone into areas that they ought not to have bothered to gone into because it had nothing to do with the financial viability of the community in this city. And yet they did that, and we're going to have to pay for that billing. But from this point to the next audit, I think we need a new audit team in. And so my vote would be to replace this audit team now. And I could make other comments and other points in here, but that's the basic premise for what my philosophy is and why my no vote was on the paying of the bill in the first place.
Any other comment, questions?
The only comment I have, I've been here for a while, and they've gone through a lot of things and had to go back, I understand. Maybe as far as the hangars, I'm not up on that, but some of the things that are here, they had to go back to 2006 to get some information and to bring us up to date. And last year, we didn't go through our budget, which was a very big mistake. And as far as I'm concerned, as long as I'm here, I think we will every year, mid-year, and at the end of the year. This thing was a little surprising. Excuse me. And I don't think we can fault the auditors for what's in this book, if these are the things that are what the city has gone through and what we've done. As far as Mike being unhappy, maybe he's right, but we can't fault the numbers when the numbers are in front of us.
Anyone else?
Well, Rudy, I would just caution this council as well as our city manager in looking at changing the auditors again. We could put out the 2007-2008 audit another 20 months potentially by bringing in a new auditor. I just don't see any purpose or what good that does us. I would never be in favor of that. If you want to look at bringing in a new auditor, then it would be for the current fiscal year that we're in. I'm not saying I'd support that either, but I just think it's very problematic, and it's going to cause the 2007-2008 audit to be pushed out to who knows when, and thus make this city and this council look bad once again.
Well, I think the final call with regard to who does the next audit rightfully belongs with the city manager. I will support whatever decision or recommendation he makes. That said, I'm not sure that tonight is the night that we intend to go through this. I have read this audit with a fine-tooth comb, and I have underlined and annotated and raised questions about many aspects of this audit, and certainly there's not enough time to go through even my piece of it tonight. But just addressing the suggestion of whether or not we look for other auditors, I have to point out, I don't know whether anybody else did this or not, but I did. I went back and got I got a copy of the 2006 audit, and I read the 2006 audit preparatory to going through this audit. That was a clean audit from a well-respected firm that does this stuff all over the United States. I mean, it wasn't some accountant with a shade over his eyes in the back room. This was a first-class organization, and they found no fault in the city's accounting records. Most of you know that accounting department, good or bad, right or wrong, has been together for a long time. Created under Adair Most regime. Most of us on this council held her in very high esteem, and not once was any of us made aware by other auditors that the process that she had put in place and that her staff implemented was flawed in any way. Now, I ask you to think about that in the context of the 2006 audit. It's an unqualified audit followed by recognition. I went and got a copy of the recognition that the city of Victorville got in for the 2006 audit, complimenting the city on its accounting and its finance and its auditing procedures. Now, that's not to say that maybe they were wrong. But, for me, trying to be as objective as I can, when I get this audit, which is the following year, and it basically shreds everything that had been done year by year by year through 2006 and gets statewide accolades in the form of the city being singled out, I say to myself, what in the world happened in a matter of less than a few months? Because when the audit process started for the fiscal 2007 audit, we weren't that far from the completion of the 2006. So I have a huge question in my mind how we could go from those kinds of very positive comments and accolades into what can only be categorized based upon the comments in this audit as a complete repudiation of the former auditors and all of the years of effort put in by the staff and Adair Most to put this thing together. And I'm troubled by that. It may be that these auditors are right. It may be that everything that had been done before was wrong. But when you look at the curriculum vitae of the auditing firm that we had, they're as qualified and as competent and has a list of clients equal to the folks that we currently have. That troubles me. Much of the commentary in here with regard to what they say are lack of internal controls, I would disagree with many of their conclusions. And at some point, I'm sure we're going to be afforded the time to delve into that. But I think, rather than just dwell on the negatives, I think some of the things that we ought to look at and be proud of. When you read the audit, there's no accusations in here that anybody stole any money, that our investments were bad and went to hell in a handbasket. You look at the commentary, there's actually a lot of accolades in this audit for a lot of things that the city does even through today. But I think it's important to note that there's no indication in here of embezzlement or theft. They even say that our investments have been sound. Most of the criticism comes from, as Councilman Rothschild has mentioned it, management prerogatives that rightly belong to this council. I disagree with the impairment tests and the impairment rationale associated with Foxborough and associated with hangars at George Air Force Base. At some point would welcome the opportunity to have a session focused just on those issues. Those are the two most critical issues in this report. I raised those issues early on with the auditors, and we're all there. And obviously, the auditors disagree with my comments about how RDAs function. I simply said then, and I'll repeat now, if the auditors are correct, then I think redevelopment agencies throughout the state of California are in serious trouble, because the very substance of what a redevelopment agency does is severely challenged in comments contained in this audit. And at some point, I think those things have to be addressed. But while I'm not happy with the audit is what it is. And to the extent that there are things that need to be addressed and corrected, I'm confident that this council will do it. I certainly would like to know in more detail why they feel that there is a lack of internal control or lack of adequate internal control. And I'm troubled about things that there is an honest and sincere difference of opinion. It has been stated that our accounting system is not adequate for the job, and that our software programs are not adequate for the job. Just use San Bernardino County as an example. There are cities in this county, much bigger than us, that are using the exact same software that we use, the PeopleSoft software. I've been in meetings, as you have, where there have been comments made, representations made, that the software program is not up to speed, can't do the job, and that there's a lack of dialogue between the IT department who runs the software and finance. It was before you became the city manager, Mr. Cox, so if you take umbrage to what I'm about to say, it wasn't on your watch. I asked John Roberts permission to talk to the IT department. He gave it, and I asked, had there been any discussions with Chris Stathis and the auditors concerning the PeopleSoftware program? I was here when Chris Stathis was hired. I have no reason to doubt his honesty and his integrity. And at the time I asked him, he had not been contacted by the auditors. I find that to be troublesome, that we're going to condemn an entire system and therefore a department, and the very people that are condemned and charged with these responsibilities are not included in the dialogue. I'm very, very troubled about that. And, you know, I could go on and on and on with those kinds of concerns that I have, but that will just give you a flavor of why I am concerned about going forward with these auditors for the next round of audit. I think that at this point, city manager's job to ultimately make a recommendation to this council, and I'll reserve my judgment until that occurs. But I do hope at some point that we have an opportunity to go through these materials in greater detail. I hope that spending 4 or 5 days over the weekend since we got this stuff won't to be in vain, and that there will be opportunities to go through this stuff in greater detail. But I agree with Councilman Rothschild. I think that the impairment tests that have been used, in my opinion, are flawed. I don't know that this is the appropriate forum to debate it, but those are my very preliminary comments regarding many of the aspects of
I agree with the impairment with Mike Rothschild and Terry Culver regarding the impairment. Trying to really understand that, but from the people that I've talked to that are involved with this sort of thing, they said that is not right. So I have to go with that. Regarding the audit, the next audit, I will leave it up to our city manager. He has gone through this. He's got the experience, and I would ask that he provide a recommendation to us on what he wants to do. Regarding this audit, I found the numbers. The numbers are what I looked at, and I think the numbers are correct. The other things that we talked about, of course, we have issues with us, but as far as the numbers, from my perspective, when I looked at them, I found the numbers to be correct, and really it was enlightening for me to see those, because I know where those numbers, where the numbers went and where they came from. So to me, that was, I was I'm prepared to accept the audit, the bottom line being the numbers, but the other issues, we still need to discuss those.
Just to make one other oversight, it's a big number, and just for anybody that follows the big numbers on the balance sheet and everything else, because of the terminologies and the way they do their accounting, the city lost $206 million. It's referred to as a net asset number. You add the two numbers together, it comes up to ostensibly what you're used to up to this point in time. But fact is that the way they balance their sheet out, it does show a $200 million decline in the net assets of the city based on the way they do the audit versus the way that it has been done in the past. And so it doesn't allude to anything more than different, I guess, auditing teams are defining their terms differently and then displaying them back to the council and the community at large. So that's where the $206 million went. It's more of a semantics game, I guess, if you will, at the moment. To me, it's important, but it's not a real loss. It's not a dollar and cent loss type of issue.
Now, there is a letter, it's referred to as SAS 112 letter, and in the introduction here, the memorandum, it said that was forthcoming. Is that going to be presented tonight? Okay. And the summary then will be presented at that time?
John Sullivan, Finance Director. Not knowing the format and process that Council preferred to go through this tonight, I invited Gary Caprici and Ken Poon, principals in the firm of Caprici and Larson, to attend this meeting to answer any questions that you may have. The document that you have in front of you is the draft audit, which has been completed except for the insertion of an opinion letter. There is two other documents that will accompany. One is the SAS 112 letter, which is a letter to management, which outlines matters of significant interest to management. Members of council have already seen the contents of that letter. Those matters have been discussed, and it is a normal and recurring practice for CPA firms to meet with the client during the course of the audit if there are significant matters that the client should be aware of on an immediate basis. Just so that you know, those series of meetings began on or about February 5th, 2008. And for the last 12 months, there's been very little change in those matters, the SAS 112 letter. Council has looked at that, and there are some changes, some modifications, but the issues raised in those letters have remained unchanged since February of 2008. The CPAs are here to answer any questions that council may have. Before introducing them, I would like to make just 2 points of clarification with respect to the audit report. The audit report is composed of 2 sets of documents, essentially. One is management's discussion and analysis. The other are the numbers, and council members have been through the numbers. The management's discussion and analysis is required for all financial reports, including public companies, SEC, especially for cities. The MD&A is intended to highlight information that might not otherwise be apparent from a simple reading of the financial statements. Now, in drafting the MD&A, I drafted it. I took great pains during this MD&A to point out strengths, but also in an MD&A, you're required to provide any analysis of potential weaknesses to the city. This, as Mr. Caldwell mentioned, was distributed last week, and at that time I requested that if there were any questions or comments, or if any reader felt that any commentary in the MD&A was inaccurate, misleading, or in the wrong tone, that the reader would come back to me. And I did not talk to anyone on council, with 1 or 2 exceptions, and I had no reports that anything was in here. But an MD&A cannot be misleading. It cannot take a material deviation from the financial statements. The MD&A is supposed to describe what's in those financial statements and what they mean. Regretfully, they have to disclose that there are certain elements of the city operating at a huge negative loss. Regrettably, we had to discuss the fact that our general fund reserves have been used at a very rapid pace. You'll see in the document that as of 2008, as of 2007, the general fund reserve had declined to a balance of approximately $17 million, with a projection for '08 down to $2 million. And at a $2 million balance in the general fund, that is insufficient for the general fund to provide the financial support to the other funds that the city has. That includes fire, Parks and Rec, and VEMIS. And so I want to tell council members one and all, as well as the city, in drafting the MD&A, you will note there is no casting of aspersions. Everything in here is factual, in my opinion. Everything in here will be borne out by subsequent financial statements. Regretfully, there's other things in here that we had to point out in an MD&A, such as threats to the city. The city has 2 significant debt obligations that there are issues with, and that is a required disclosure to go into the financial statements. It's not just a requirement under generally accepted accounting principles for GASB and FASB, but it is also a requirement under rules promulgated by the Securities and Exchange Commission, rules that apply to the issuance of debt. Should the city or any entity were to have produced a financial statement with an MD&A that glossed over or did not address fundamental weaknesses, and if those financial statements were used for the purpose of issuing debt, then that could be a very serious problem in violation of securities laws and fraud statutes. So I went through this document on a number of occasions. I did not look back. I did not try to second guess. I just explained the facts in these documents as I knew it on how Victorville Municipal Services came into being, what their business model was, how that business ended up with a net loss. And I will say again, that net loss, there are many, many conditions that existed during the time when various business enterprises were undertaken. Conditions, and I pointed out in this document, conditions existing in 2004, 2005, 2006, 2007, but the world changed in 2007. Decisions which I will say, in retrospect, had every chance of success. VEMIS, good decision. But we did not know in 2004 and 2005 that the mode of operation, from going from gas-based generators to diesel to biodiesel, we did not know when we adopted that business plan that natural gas would almost triple in price, diesel fuel would triple, biodiesel would triple. So our business model, which, as Mr. Rothschild has mentioned on many occasions, we set up VEMIS knowing it was going to take a small loss. That's an economic incentive. We did that to create jobs. That's what a city does. When we looked at that business process, we figured we would lose a little bit of money, not a lot, but that economic incentive was well worth it to the citizens. What changed? And as we all know, what changed was the price of gasoline, price of diesel fuel, relative inefficiencies in various forms of electrical generation equipment. That changed. And as a result, we have some issues that we have to deal with today. And as council is well aware, we entered into a major initiative which was recommended universally by consultants, by people in the energy business, the Victorville too. Why did we do that? We did that for the very reasons that have been stated for years. Build jobs, create stability in this community, create a revenue stream that would not be taken away from the city. Those are very laudable goals. That whole series of transactions and that business plan was entered into with the loftiest of goals. We made good decisions. I say we, as in the city universally and going back several years. We made decisions based upon experts, many experts. And as time went on, no one would have envisioned 2 years ago that all the banks would have failed, that the banks would have been nationalized, that General Motors and Chrysler are on the verge of filing bankruptcy, that all the New York financing houses are virtually out of business, that counterparties, which are a required element in creating long-term energy contracts, offsets, power purchase agreements, all of those entities, no one could possibly have imagined that those entities would be on the verge of failure in 2007 and 2008. Now, we have to live with decisions made in a time when the world had changed. And regretfully, those decisions now are things that we have to deal with. But again, I want to emphasize, and that as the management discussion analysis does point out, Decisions were made in 2004 through 2005 in an environment that no longer exists. And I wanted to point that out. So as far as the document on pages 1 through possibly 26 or so, which is a management's discussion and analysis, I've been through this, and on significant points, I have shared information with, especially regarding DeVemus, a change in business plan, a change in business model. This is not just something that I wrote one night. I don't believe that any of the information in the MD&A is incorrect or tilted or biased. I believe every word in here is absolutely accurate and does reflect the financial position of the city and dovetails into the numbers. I realize council has some differences of opinion with the concept of impairment. Impairment is something that's been around in various rules-making bodies for many, many years. It is not a new standard for government accounting. Impairment is real. And Mr. Rothschild indicated that an impairment, that's what RDAs do, and that is true. Cities are set up RDAs, redevelopment agencies that are created as a redevelopment agency. They are set up to give away stuff, basically to create incentives for business. But anytime an RDA creates an incentive for a business, they create an expense on their books. So the impairment on the hangars, that was an incentive program. It was done in order to get businesses into the airport. So you can't give away something without recognizing an expense, and that's what the impairment test is on the hangars. The impairment test on electrical generation equipment, I don't think anyone has any questions or any unresolved issues with that. I think of all the information we see here, the only two issues that are worthy of discussion, and I agree with council members who mentioned that, is the impairment issue. But we all know that we lease the airport hangars at an amount such that we could not recover our investment over the life of the hangars. We did so willfully to create jobs, to get the good businesses out there, to jumpstart that airport. So I think it's difficult to imagine how we did not create an expense, which in accounting terminology is called impairment. If council so chooses, I would introduce the auditors to ask any specific questions you may have as to any other area of the audit.
Any
Question
questions?
for you, John.
Yes, sir.
Did you write this, page 11, is that part of your analysis or their analysis? It, on the area I'm looking at there, is it says deficient operations for proprietary funds.
Yes.
And over here, you identified the proprietary funds as the sanitary district, municipal utility, water district, golf course. I sat on that water board for 9 years, unless the rules have changed, and I assume that the sanitary district might be the same. You can't have a surplus in those two areas. Now, you can have a capital improvement fund building, you can have O&M and everything else, but how do you get a surplus for those two funds? And the golf course, I defy any municipality in the state of California to tell me that they're making money on a golf course, municipal golf course, I mean.
No. Well, let's talk about, first of all, the definition of a proprietary fund. The funds within the city of Victorville were defined as either government funds or proprietary funds or fiduciary funds or whatever the fund designation. There were no changes in designations this year. All of the entities that existed this year followed the same classifications that have been assigned to those various funds or entities for many, many years. On page 11, the discussion was centered on two proprietary funds. First of all, a proprietary fund is a piece of business of the city that is business-like. So obviously, a water company, that's a business-like because we sell goods and services to the public. Water is one. Sanitation is one. SCLA is one because their source of revenue, they're there to make a profit and to do something. It is not just a government fund which essentially receives taxes and then spends it for the benefit of the people. It is intended to make a profit. That page 11 discussion was focused on two proprietary funds that are operating at a deficit, and that is VEMUS and SCLA. And the only point of mentioning this was to dovetail into the preceding discussion on demands and encumbrances upon the general fund. You know, as we know from discussions for the last 2 years, or last year and a half anyway, because I haven't been here for 2 years, Our general fund reserves have been significantly depleted. What that means is that we, in the general fund, we are the father, I guess, and we have responsibilities to support these other funds, and we have supported those other funds. The general fund does provide a huge amount of subsidies, if you will, to VEMUS. The general fund pays the fire contract. We pay for any cost overruns or any expenses that are not otherwise covered at the golf course. So the general fund, the text says the general fund must be viewed as a source of economic stability for all other funds, because other funds don't necessarily operate at a profit. Our fire district, for example, we had lots of fire department people, and they don't generate any revenue, so the general fund has to pay that. And the utility company, the utilities have not been able to generate an operating profit. So again, the general fund has to step in and support their operations. This discussion on the proprietary funds was limited to two funds, the two funds that need the most help from the general fund. But at the same time, the expenses of the general fund have increased at a rapid pace while revenues have declined. And that was intended to alert you, as the reader, to the fact that general fund revenues are in a decline, but general fund expenses have increased and are not expected to subside for some time. And at some point, the general fund will not have a surplus and not be able to support the operations of these two specific funds. The text indicates that there's a projected balance at the June 30 of 08 of about $2 million in the general fund. That's $2 million. But yet in the year 08, there are requests for funding out of the general fund of $14–15 million. Or, I'm sorry, going forward to 09.
Challenge you right there. VEMUS is, in fact, was up to this year at least, a drain and a negative. There's going to be a long time before we would ever see, quote, a surplus. However, from next year forward, VEMUS begins to become a revenue source for the general fund again. It turns back around.
It does.
How do you show it when it's starting to show generate? It could be $1 million, it could be $10 million in 5 years. What if it had $10 million coming in? You're not talking about it as a $10 million surplus. It's not that at all. It's a revenue source that we've created over this platform that we've put in place.
Exactly. And when VEMUS begins to make serious money, now they are not quite in the black, but as counsel has mentioned, as you have been quoted as saying, VEMUS is on the verge of being in the black, and it is. With the continued development at SCLA, that creates the customer base for VEMUS. VEMUS has remodeled itself, that's discussed in this document, so that they are established to make a gross operating margin, a profitable margin. As the financial statements show, for example, because of the run-up in natural gas, diesel, and biodiesel, for every dollar that VEMUS generated, it cost $3 in fuel. And that had to be reversed. And so that was the impetus for changing the basic business model of VEMUS from self-generation to interconnection, even at a discount. Roughly speaking, VEMUS can purchase electricity off the grid for maybe an 11 or 12% discount from Southern Cal Edison retail rates, so we can afford to give a 10% discount on Southern Cal Edison and still make a positive margin. But as you mentioned, what really will happen is the continued development at SCLA, then VEMUS will make a substantial operating profit. Since it is a component of the general fund, it is a proprietary fund. To the extent that they make money, they essentially just pay a dividend back to the general fund. So you are correct. The general fund will stand to gain significantly in the long run, much as we had hoped, sincerely hoped, would have occurred with Victorville II. Victorville II had a huge potential for profitability several years out. But as with the general economy, banking systems failed. The price for power, the price for fuel, all of those things are beyond control of this council, beyond control of anyone that I know, and those things changed, and they changed not in our favor. But we're addressing those issues at this time.
A question, John. The transfers from the general fund to VMSU and SCLA, were those recorded as loans or
There's two ways to record those.
I'm sorry?
There's two ways to record them. First, we can record them as a loan if we expect to be repaid. The other way we record it is a transfer, and a transfer is a below-the-line revenue source. The difference is if it's a transfer, if it's a loan, then the receiving entity or receiving fund will show it as a liability, and so you've got say $1 million. It's either going to be a liability or it's going to be in your net worth. If it's a transfer, then it just goes into your net worth and stays
See,
there.
like the transfer to the fire district or the golf course, or not the golf course, but the community services district, those are just
Typically,
transfers in
right, typically,
operation.
yes, typically the city would prefer to use transfers because if it's a loan, you expect to repay, but the general fund and the city expects to make transfers. We expect to transfer to support these parks and rec. We actually expect it. As was just pointed out, cities don't make big profits on golf courses. That is an item of public benefit. And if they don't make money, then it is the general city that transfers money and contributes and supports them financially.
Any other questions?
Mayor, I'd like to assure the council that my goal was to get the audit out. My goal is to get the next audit out, not to have any delay whatsoever. I've got to make sure there's not another delay. I've got to make sure that there's not another 20 months of delay. There are some personnel issues and other issues that I'm hesitant to talk about because I was told that there were certain things that weren't in play and no checks and balances, and I've talked to some of the employees that have been here for a long time, say they in fact are in place. I'm prepared to come forward and state that, the fact that those comments are just wrong. When you hire an auditor, they're required to have errors and omissions. If we have required to pay $350,000 over a $82,000 bid, I want to make sure the past auditors had them. We had to redo their work. Somebody, in my opinion, is going to pay us for that. Someone is going to pay us for that. That's not right. It's absolutely wrong. We rely on auditors. We relied on the past auditors. We rely on this audit. If they have done significant work that this next audit can come out in short order, and they have brought to our attention the internal control weaknesses, which finance director will be responsible for putting those in place, adopting those, forwarding those to the auditor, making sure that they're acceptable in their areas of concerns. So if that's the reason you get a no opinion, that'll be corrected before the next audit come out. I want to know those things because that's the individual responsible for writing all of those rules to make sure that there's not internal control weaknesses. The oddity, the odd, almost humorous thing is that you received a bid and then you received and then I'm told, I'm new, I just got here, supplemental agreements totaling a total of $157,000, but now you know you owe $210,000. I'm not authorized to pay that. It was never brought back as a change order to the council. And yet the individuals continue to build, and that's just an absolute perfect example of internal control weaknesses created by the very people who brought it to your attention. That doesn't make any sense, and I want to be able to take the time to look at this, get an answer, find out exactly what they are, give the finance director the opportunity to write those, to write a plan, submit that, make sure it's acceptable. I want to talk to the past auditors to see if they have an opinion of whether or not they believe that they have a right to come in and make the corrections or answer to the charges that, in fact, they were derelict. And I do believe that, based upon the research that I've done so far and talking with other auditors, that we have an obligation to notify them that. We can't avoid that, in my opinion. I want to be able to the audit is independent. And I made an attempt to discuss the impairment on the hangars based upon my experience, but not as an auditor. I made no headway whatsoever. So I went and talked to another auditor and gave him a hypothetical case. And the answer was, you're absolutely right, it's a footnote. not an impairment. I want another opinion. I'm entitled to that. I think this council's entitled to that. Do we move ahead with the current auditors? I don't know. After I discussed the matter with them, they didn't want to discuss it before the audit. Don't want anyone saying that we interfered or tried to change the outcome in any way, shape, or form. But I can't find any contract with the current audit. Before I sign one, I want to make sure I know what I'm getting and how long it's going to take and what conditions are in place that we need to make to ensure that we get an audit. And if we can, probably not an unqualified audit, but I think we deserve a qualified audit at best, maybe. But somebody who tells me they're not going to listen to me and they're going to have no opinion no matter what I say, kind of tells me they don't want to work with me. So give me a chance to look into it. I'll get back to the council as soon as I can. I think the public deserves to see the audit as soon as they can, the 2007, 2008. I think the council deserves to see the audit. We want to get that done, and we want it done quickly. But I certainly don't want it done with a cloud over it. I think it's time to clear the issue for everyone.
So our next step is to accept this audit.
This audit is done. It's a public document. The council has authorized payment. It's been submitted. It's a public document. And even though there may be another letter or something to be submitted, I think the concentration from this moment forward is on the 2007, 2008 audit.
Well, I think that information has already been provided. It's going to be formatted in this letter, but according to the report here, we already have the information. So, is there a motion to accept the audit?
Also move?
Second.
That ends the special meeting, and our regular meeting will start at 7.